Hello, and welcome to the second episode in this series which explores the history of Magic the Gathering by looking at a single card from every standard legal, non-reprint set. This episode will look at the cards from Fallen Empires, Ice Age, Homelands, Alliances, Mirage, Visions, and Weatherlight. For each of these sets, I'm attempting to pick a card which encapsulates the set's themes and the design philosophies which were behind its creation. Anyway, with the intro out of the way, let's begin with Fallen Empires. Fallen Empires was released in November 1994. The card which we'll be using to represent it is Dwarven Soldier. Now, Dwarven Soldier, although decidedly unimpressive by today's standards, was actually used in a few competitive decks in 1997, 3 years after its release. Jeff Donnet piloted a deck entitled Red Deck Wins to victory on day 1 of the 1997 World Tournament, sort of the Pro Tour or the Mythic Championship of its day. This deck contained a single copy of Dwarven Soldiers. These Red Deck Wins were amongst the first iterations of mono-red aggro decks which we know and love today. Then, just as now, they provided a low-cost, aggressive deck that was viable competitively. As for the reason why Dwarven Soldier was being run, well, it sort of says more about the paucity of viable low-cost creatures in Magic's early years than it does about Dwarven Soldier's actual strength. But Dwarven Soldier's small but notable competitive presence isn't why I'm using it to represent Fallen Empires. The card demonstrates the set's primary themes in other ways. Fallen Empires, as its name would imply, is a set about empires in decline waging war against one another. It was arguably Magic's first tribal set, in other words, a set which makes creature types matter. Although cards which cared about creature type had existed since Alpha, namely Goblin King, Lord of Atlantis, and Zombie Master, Fallen Empires was the first time making creature types matter was brought to the forefront. Although there have been many tribal sets released since Fallen Empires, most recently Ixalan and Rivals of Ixalan, none of them are quite like Fallen Empires. Most modern tribal sets feature a handful of creature types, spread across several colours. For instance, if we look at Ixalan, vampires are in black and white, merfolk are in blue and green, dinosaurs are in red, white and green, and pirates are in black, blue and red. So that's 4 creature types that matter, each of which is spread across either 2 or 3 colours. Fallen Empires, meanwhile, features 11 different creature types, 2 for every colour, apart from red, which has 3, orcs, goblins and dwarves. The idea was that every colour contained different factions, which were at war with one another. So in blue, the merfolk and the homerids being these sort of crab people, were fighting one another for space, as the seas slowly froze and Dominaria's Ice Age approached. This theme is shown on Dwarven Soldier, which has 2 more toughness whenever it fights an orc, one of its rival factions. Conceptually, this is a really interesting idea, but there just wasn't enough room in a single set to give each of these 11 tribes any great depth or identity. This is compounded by Fallen Empire's small size when compared to sets like Ixalan, which had 279 cards, whilst Fallen Empires only has 102 cards in which to cram all of these different tribes. To Wizards of the Coast's credit, however, they did come up with a rather innovative solution to get across the idea that this was a large-scale war, despite the set's small size. Dwarven Soldier, along with several other cards from Fallen Empires, features several alternative artworks. This way, when players are building their decks, they can put in several copies of Dwarven Soldier with differing artwork to get the idea across that there's an army composed of several different Dwarven Soldiers, or a warband with several different Elvish scouts, etc. So, alternative artworks in Magic the Gathering stretch back years. They've recently come back into focus, with alternative art Planeswalkers from a Japanese release of War of the Spark, and the various variants which have been printed in every set starting with Eldraine. So to wrap all of this up, Dwarven Soldier shows us 3 things about Fallen Empires. That early aggro decks ran bad cards, because there weren't many alternatives available, that it cared about creature types, and that it made use of neat alternative artwork. Next up is Ice Age, which came out in June 1995. It's famously regarded as one of the most complex expansions in the history of the game. The reasons for this complexity can be seen by looking to its chief designer. Scaphalias headed the design of Ice Age, one of Magic the Gathering's East Coast playtesters, who helped Richard Garfield balance Alpha. Scaphalias is a learned man, studying physics and mathematics at the universities of Princeton and Pennsylvania respectively. In a 2004 article on the creation of Ice Age, Scaphalias states that he and the rest of the Ice Age design team were, by training and temperament, overly familiar with arguments being provably winnable, and didn't always have the skills and inclination required for compromise. Initially, rather than an expansion, Ice Age was to a certain extent the way its design group thought the game itself should be. A man with a passionate interest in mathematics, Scaphalias brought this love for intricate calculations into the game, and designed Ice Age as a complex set which would appeal to other mathematicians. The card which I'm choosing to represent Ice Age is probably the set's most famous, and certainly its most impactful card, Necropotence. First of all, I feel Necropotence is a good fit, as it demonstrates the set's complexity. Scaphalias himself has stated that Necropotence is his favourite card from the set, as it embodies the principles of design we strove for. It changes the player's most basic calculations. What are cards and life worth? calculations done consistently, correctly, only by the best players. I've also chosen Necropotence due to its staggering impact on Magic's competitive scene. The card was initially dismissed as a junk rare and left forgotten. It was only later on the card was figured out. People began to realise the incredible amount of card draw it offered vastly offset the cost in life required to use it. Players could now see, and this is a view that's still held today, that life is a resource, and as long as it's above 0, it doesn't really matter. So exchanging slices of life for cards was a fantastic deal. The rise of Necropotence was partially enabled by the restriction of Black Vice in February 1996. Black Vice was a card which acted as a fairly hard counter to Necropotence and held it in check. With Black Vice cut down to a single copy per deck, Necropotence's true potential came to the fore, and decks based around it rose to absolute prominence. The summer of 1996 is still referred to as Black Summer, due to the heavy presence of Necropotence decks and other decks built specifically to counter them, ruling the meta. Homelands, released in October 1995, is the second set in Ice Age block. Sort of. A block is a collection of 3, later on only 2, sets, linked by common narrative and mechanical themes. All Magic sets from Ice Age onwards were sorted into blocks, until the release of Dominaria in April 2018, when the model was abandoned. I say Homelands is sort of a part of Ice Age block, because it was at the time, but it isn't anymore. Ice Age block is a weird block, because the story is about the rise and conclusion of Dominaria's Ice Age, except it's abandoned in Homelands, which instead tells a story about vampires on the plane of Olgrotha, a completely different part of the multiverse from Dominaria, where Ice Age and alliances occur. The 2006 set Cold Snap later retroactively replaced Homelands as the second set in the block, but we'll get to that when we come to it, in 11 years. So anyway, which card am I going to use to represent Homelands? Hungry Mists. This is probably quite an unconventional choice. Serrated Arrows is probably the first card that comes to mind when Homelands is brought up. So what does Hungry Mists represent here? Well, essentially, Hungry Mist is a bad card, which perfectly represents Homelands, because it's a bad set. Widely disliked at the time of its release, and looking back retroactively, Homelands was criticised for having a low power level and poorly designed cards. Hungry Mists encapsulates both of these negative aspects of the set. A 6-2 for 4 mana with no form of evasion and a downside, Hungry Mist is a card which has never been used in a competitive deck. The card is in fact so forgettable that I've gotten its name wrong several times so far and called it Hungry Mists rather than Hungry Mist by mistake. Although to look on the bright side, Homelands did receive praise for its story, which occurred in a creative world built upon Dracula and vampire tropes, with some Minotaurs sprinkled in for good measure. The world's first Pro Tour was held in New York in February 1996. A handicap was imposed on players entering this tournament, forcing them to include 5 cards from every set in the standard format of the time. This restriction is largely seen as an attempt to incentivise players to include Homelands cards in their deck. After a pause of 8 months, the longest in the game's history, a gap which is largely seen as being related to the negative reception which Homelands received, Alliances was finally brought out in June 1996. Alliances further developed many of the themes introduced in Ice Age, such as cumulative upkeep, a cost which needs to be paid each turn to keep a permanent in play, emphasising allied colours, and cantrips, low-cost, low-impact spells that let you draw a card. Alliances did introduce one novel concept not seen in Ice Age, however, so-called pitch cards. Pitch cards are cards which can be cast for free if you exile a card of the same colour from your hand. You remove them from the game, to use the terminology of the time. A cycle, meaning a card of each colour, of pitch cards were printed in Alliances, one of which is our card of choice to represent the set. 4 of the 5 pitch cards in the cycle are completely forgettable, like Contagion, which is significant only because of a cat in its artwork, and Bounty of the Hunt, which gives you free +1/+1 counters. Yay! Sitting high above all these other cards, costing around $50 rather than a handful of cents, is Force of Will. Force of Will has a simple effect. It's just a counter spell, but the secret to its strength lies in the fact that it's impossible to anticipate. Usually you need to leave some of your lands untapped in order to cast a counter spell, signalling to a savvy opponent that you've got a counter prepared and encouraging them to play cautiously and to avoid casting anything big while you can potentially answer it. The fact you can cast Force of Will without paying a single point of mana means your opponent can't possibly see it coming. This is devastatingly powerful, as there's absolutely no way to play around it. Some non-blue decks even ran 4 copies of Force of Will, which could exile each other, thus granting decks of every colour access to difficult-to-anticipate counterspells. Force of Will's impact on the game was referenced by the printing of the card Force of Negation in Modern Horizons in 2019. Force of Negation is a modern playable, but weakened version of Force of Will, which can't be cast for free on your turn, and with no ability to counter creature spells. That this weakened version of Force of Will still commands a price tag in the $30 range demonstrates the high power of a counterspell which you can't see coming, and the indelible legacy which Force of Will has left behind. Released in October 1996, Mirage marked the start of Magic the Gathering's second block, Mirage block. With its first 2 sets on the Dominarian continent of Jamora, which is based on Africa. Mirage block focused around two central mechanics: flanking, an ability which makes blocking creatures weaker, and phasing, an ability which brings cards in and out of play each turn. Although the card we'll be using to represent Mirage doesn't possess new mechanics, but rather marks an attempt to call back to the past. Lion's Eye Diamond was an attempt to create a fixed Black Lotus. In other words, a card similar to Black Lotus, but better balanced. To put it bluntly, this didn't work. At least not in the long term. Lion's Eye Diamond has the same effect as Black Lotus, except in order to use Lion's Eye Diamond, you need to discard your entire hand. A massive downside, right? Pretty much can't get any more restrictive than that. The problem is that no amount of downside can suitably restrict Black Lotus's effect. If there was a Black Lotus variant which required you to give your firstborn child to Wizards of the Coast, vintage players would still use it. Lion's Eye Diamond's downside, though incredibly prohibitive at the time, became less and less impactful as more ways of interacting with the graveyard or of turning discard into an upside came into print. Cards with the ability Madness can be played when they're discarded, circumventing the intention of Lion's Eye Diamond. Additionally, if the effective Infernal Tutor is responded to by activating Lion's Eye Diamond, then you can search for any card from your deck, whilst generating free mana which you can use to cast it. This enables many crazy combos, most notably in decks built around the Storm mechanic, which we'll cover when we get to Onslaught block. Now we turn to Visions, the second set in Mirage block, released on the 3rd of February 1997. The card which I'm using to represent Visions is Teferi's Honor Guard. I mentioned above that flanking and phasing were the two primary mechanics of Mirage block, and Teferi's Honor Guard has both. Flanking was often given to knights, and acted as a representation of their ability to outflank opposing creatures, due to the mobility which being on horseback afforded them. Teferi's Honor Guard demonstrates this, being a knight with a horse in their artwork. Phasing represented using magic to pull oneself into and out of reality through manipulating the flow of time. It's highly associated with the character Teferi, a planeswalker who manipulates time, as demonstrated by the mechanic returning for the first time in 23 years in Core Set 2021, which is themed around Teferi. So Teferi's Honor Guard represents Visions and Mirage block more broadly, as it possesses both of the block's marquee mechanics, and demonstrates the link of the phasing mechanic to the character Teferi. In June 1997, Magic the Gathering's story would begin its first long arc, with the release of the Weatherlight set. The Weatherlight saga ties together every set from here until the release of Apocalypse in 2001. It's about the crew of the Weatherlight, a magical airship which can fly between the different planes of the multiverse. It's sort of a fantasy Star Trek, told both through the cards and several tie-in novels. It's slightly odd that Weatherlight was chosen to be the starting point of a story arc, considering it's the final part of a 3-part block, but just as Homelands disrupted Ice Age's story right in the middle, Weatherlight ended the story of Mirage block and the continent of Jamora prematurely. Unlike Homelands, Weatherlight did at least have significant mechanical continuity with the other two sets in its block. Both phasing and flanking remained, but Weatherlight did introduce one new and weird twist, caring about the order of cards in your graveyard. The card which I've chosen to represent this set demonstrates Weatherlight caring about this weird and arbitrary factor. Barrow Ghoul is a 4/4 zombie for only 2 mana, but with the downside of requiring you to exile the top creature card in your graveyard from play. This weird ghoul, along with a few other black cards from Weatherlight, such as Spinning Darkness and Bone Dancer, means that if you're playing a format like Vintage or Legacy where these cards are legal, if you ever look through your graveyard and you don't put the cards back in the same order, then you're technically a cheating cheater who cheats. If you're a mean person, then you can put these cards in your commander deck to disqualify opponents for accidentally reordering their graveyard, but please don't do that. Also, quick side note, though I didn't feel the card was quite worthy of representing the set, one of my favourite pieces of art in the game is on the card Orcish Settlers, which was released in Weatherlight. It's the painting American Gothic, but it depicts orcs rather than humans, and their house is burning in the background. I just think this is a neat little artistic reference tucked away in the game. So, here we are at the end of part 2. The Ice Age of Dominaria has come and gone, and we've just begun a long voyage aboard the Weatherlight. Next up, Tempest block, which introduced one of the game's most beloved tribes, followed by the overpowered excitement of Urza's block. But that'll be next time. For now, what do you all think? If you had to pick a card to summarise any of the sets I've mentioned in this video, which card would you choose? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in part 3.